And now I'm joined live from Bath in England by Dr. Bharat Pankhania, who's a senior clinical lecturer at the University of Exeter Medical School. Dr. Pankhania, thank you so much for joining us again here today on The Edge.
Pleasure.
Today I'm going to take our conversation backwards, and rather than starting with the headline, which is the Omicron variant, I want to just think about the fact that we're entering winter. I quite fancy the idea of hibernating at the moment to escape from all the things that winter brings. But what winter brings with it seasonal illnesses. Some of them are just things we shrug off. Some of them have more serious repercussions. So I've got two questions for you. How do we differentiate between these seasonal things that are just there and we have to live through every year, and the type of illnesses where we need to go to see our doctor, we need to get tested to see if there's something more serious to be done? And what should we do to mitigate these in the first place?
Very good question, and to be honest, a very important question, because every winter we have especially vulnerable people, elderly people, people who are housebound, get their infections, usual Northern Hemisphere winter infections such as influenza and pneumococcus, and then unfortunately they either end up in hospital and some of them die. And unfortunately, they forget to take their seasonal vaccines. So in order to protect yourselves, it's ever so easy to have your seasonal influenza vaccine every year. That is so important. And with respect to the pneumococcal vaccine, which is also important, you don't need to have it every year. Depends on your needs, but usually it is a 5-year cycle. So if you are protected from pneumococcus and influenza, you are in a good place.
Well, I have to admit I'd never heard of the pneumococcus vaccine before, so these are things that we should be discussing with our local doctors, I imagine, to find out, depending on our age as well and situation.
Exactly so, Andy, that, with respect to seasonal influenza, my advice would be any age group, all age groups, just do yourself a favor and get into the habit of immunizing yourself early in the autumn against seasonal influenza. With respect to pneumococcus, discuss it with your GP, don't ignore it, raise the subject, what about pneumococcus, doctor? And then see what your GP says and get yourself protected from that as well.
So this is another type of protection we need to take, these two vaccines, as well, of course, the COVID vaccines, which we'll come on to in just a moment. But the other part of my question was about how people at this time of year, they're turning on their central heating for the first time, so they get runny noses, they get coughs, maybe a little sore throat or whatever. How do people differentiate between, this just happens, the thing that happens every year, and I really ought to go and see a medical practitioner to get tested for either for influenza or maybe these days now for COVID?
That's a very difficult one, unfortunately, especially as the signs and symptoms of a COVID infection are so vague and nondescript. Similarly, it is very difficult to distinguish, have I got influenza? Have I got the common cold? Have I got COVID? So difficult. And my advice is that it is better just not to get that infection. And one way not to get it is to be as well protected as possible. And you mentioned indoor setting and we're putting on our heating, etc. That is important to do, but equally well important is also to have your house well ventilated. I know we're losing heat, it costs us money to heat the house, etc. But my advice is, if you can, periodically ventilate your house and then keep the heating on. So I'm not asking you to keep your house cold. I'm just saying have a refresh 2 or 3 times a day just to keep you healthy and fresh, have that fresh air in your house.
And this is advice, I imagine, that you would also give to places where people are working, schools and factories and so on.
Yes. Yes.
So,
yes, absolutely.
So this is something else that we should be working towards. Okay, so the seasonal illnesses are already sometimes of concern, particularly for the more elderly or the vulnerable parts of the population. We're now coming towards the second anniversary of the COVID pandemic. And people were beginning to hope to see a light at the end of the tunnel. Now, perhaps not surprisingly, I think you would say a new variant has come up in probably from somewhere in South Africa, and probably because the level of vaccinations in South Africa or across the whole of the African continent are so low. What do you want to tell us about Omicron at this stage? What do we know about it, and what should our concerns be?
So Omicron has probably arisen in someone who was immune suppressed and had a prolonged infection. And with that prolonged infection, the virus had many, many days in which to reproduce and make mistakes and suddenly emerge as variant Omicron. Now, what we know about it and what our concerns are, that at the critical points in its makeup, i.e. the spike protein, there are mutations. And what those mutations are is a change in the shape. And with that change in the shape, it may become more infectious. It may become more vaccine-induced immunity evasive. In other words, the antibodies that you've got there don't latch on to the virus and neutralize it as effectively as they used to do with the previous variants. And then the third bit is we hope that it is not more severe disease causing. At the moment, nobody knows that it is more or less infectious, more or less vaccine evasive, more or less severe disease causing. But we will find out. We will find out in about 2 weeks' time when all those experiments and theoretical models have been run, and we will know a lot more then.
Okay, so there are lots of discussions about, as you say, the issues that you just brought up, how infectious is it, what's it going to do? But the important thing coming back is coming back to vaccines, I imagine, isn't it? That we need to get populations vaccinated. Now, in the UK, I think they're just promising booster shots for everybody. But what about the people in parts of the world where the vaccine levels are so low? What needs to be done to rebalance this?
A very, very important issue you address, Andy, and this is really important. No one is well until all of us are well. What we need to do is suppress infections in other parts of the world, because if we don't suppress infections in Africa and elsewhere, then we will have these variants re-emerging. So what we should do is, whilst you're happy keeping your population happy with boosters, etc., enable Africa to immunize. Now, enabling Africa to immunize equals three things. One, the inform, advise, educate bit. Address the issues of hesitancy. There is a lot of vaccine hesitancy in Africa. And then give to them the logistics. And what I mean by logistics is the needles, the syringes, the transport to the vaccination center, the setting up of the vaccination center, and then finally also supply them with viable vaccines that they can use over a period of time to immunize their people as they come and come in large numbers to their centers to be immunized. It's a big exercise that needs to be done.
It's a big exercise, but I'm sure and complicated to get the logistics in place, but essential to keep the whole world healthy and bring this all to a close. Dr. Pankadia, unfortunately, that's all we've got time to talk today. So many more things I wanted to ask you. Thank you so much for joining us here today on The Edge.